The St Antholin lectures were first established in the 16th century. They were intended to strengthen the ministry of the Word and encourage faithfulness in the Church of England at a time of controversy and change. Revived in the 1990s, they continue that same purpose, to bring together pastors and scholars around themes drawn from our Puritan and evangelical heritage. Over the last decade, the lectures have introduced us to both famous figures and neglected voices, illuminating not only the history of the Puritans, but also their enduring significance for the Church today. The lectures are not antiquarian exercises. They are intended to sharpen our understanding of the past in order to better serve Christ in the present. By recovering the convictions, struggles, and insights of those who went before us, we are reminded of the perennial challenges of gospel ministry and the grace that sustains it. As we gather for this year's lecture, we give thanks for the opportunity to reflect once more on the Puritan legacy, not as a museum piece, but as a living testimony to the truth and power of God's Word. Next year, we'll also see the publication of Pioneers, Contenders and Reformers, exploring Puritan history, theology and practice. Gathering together the St Antholin lectures from 2011 to 2020, this new volume will offer fresh insights into Puritan conviction, controversy and courage, from Elizabethan grievances and the Great Ejection to the preaching of John Owen, the Countess of Huntingdon's connection and the Mayflower exiles. Pioneers, Contenders and Reformers will showcase leading scholars and pastors reflecting on figures and movements that shaped our evangelical heritage, reminding us why their vision still challenges and inspires the Church today. The collection will also include a new chapter that I've written specially for it on George Whitfield's sermon at St Antholin's in the 1730s. I look at how Puritanism was reborn in the 18th century in London and the controversies this sermon on justification sparked, with some application, of course, for today. So look out for Pioneers, Contenders and Reformers from the Latimer Trust website in 2026. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this year's St Antholin lecturer, Dr. Gwenfair Adams. Dr. Adams serves as Professor of Church History and Spiritual Formation and Director of the Rosell Scholars Program at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary near Boston, Massachusetts. She holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and brings to us a profound breadth of scholarship that spans the medieval, Reformation and Puritan eras. Her published works include Visions in Late Medieval England, Lay Spirituality and Sacred Glimpses of the Hidden Worlds of Faith, as well as the flagship volume on Romans 1-8 in IVP's Reformation Commentary on Scripture series. Beyond pure church history, Dr. Adams is deeply interested in the role of story and myth in shaping theological imagination, as well as the formative power of Christian spirituality. She teaches courses on C.S. Lewis's life and spirituality, medieval devotional practice, and spiritual formation through narrative. Tonight, she turns her considerable gifts to a remarkable pairing: C.S. Lewis and John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gwenfair Adams as she explores how these two storytellers, generations apart, illuminate our journey in faith.
It is my delight to be with you this evening to share with you about John Bunyan, C.S. Lewis, and allegorical pathways to heaven. For centuries, Pilgrim's Progress held pride of place next to the Bible in English-speaking Protestant Christian homes. As a continuous bestseller, it provided shared metaphors for the Christian life. Vanity Fair, Slough of Despond, Celestial City, they formed a geographical vocabulary of the soul for everyone, from Puritan divines to 19th century housewives. Famous figures in the history of the church engaged the text in their spiritual lives. In the 18th century, John Newton, the composer of Amazing Grace, wrote a preface to the 1776 edition of Pilgrim's Progress. He spoke highly of the text and its author, and closed with an altar call of sorts, calling readers to flee the city of destruction and follow the shining light of the word till you enter by Christ the straight gate into the way of salvation. In the 19th century, it was Charles Spurgeon's favorite book after the Bible. In his Pictures from Pilgrim's Progress, he stated that he'd read it over 100 times and had never tired of it. In the 20th century, J.I. Packer read it every year and recommended that others make that practice as well. He described Pilgrim's Progress as, quote, a didactic parable explaining the path of piety to ordinary people, a series of enlightening similitudes, Bunyan's word, about godliness and its opposite. A biblical dream tale with characters drawn from waking life to illustrate spiritual realities, a story that by God's grace might become the reader's own story as he or she went along, unquote. Pilgrim's Progress inspired many writers to create their own elaborate allegories and pilgrimage narratives. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in 1719 presented a hero on a solitary spiritual journey. Charles Dickens subtitled Oliver Twist with The Poor Boy's Progress. The Celestial Railroad, Nathaniel Hawthorne's allegorical short story, parodied it. Charlotte Bronte structured Jane Eyre as a secular Pilgrim's Progress that, contrary to the original, ended with the main character in effect turning back to a city of destruction. The Victorian novelist William Thackeray played off Vanity Fair in his book of that title. Mark Twain provided the new Pilgrim's Progress as an alternative title for the travelogue of his 1867 steamship tour of Europe and the Holy Land, The Innocents Abroad. Pilgrim pervaded Louisa May Alcott's Little Women in 1868, even shaping the four sisters playing pilgrimage from the cellar as the city of destruction to the housetop as the celestial city where flowers, milk, and cake awaited. John Steinbeck's mother read Pilgrim's Progress to him as a child, and some suggest it may have helped him form the structure for Grapes of Wrath in 1939, what literary critic Elizabeth Napier describes as, quote, a concerted grim modernization of Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, unquote. And this brings us to C.S. Lewis, who wrote his own version of Pilgrim's Progress in the same decade as Steinbeck's, calling it Pilgrim's Regress, 1933. It's intriguing that shortly after his conversion, Lewis looked back to a book written hundreds of years earlier as his model for sharing the story of his journey. Of all the works mentioned, Lewis's was the closest in style and purpose to Bunyan's. Since Pilgrim's Regress deliberately played off of Pilgrim's Progress, it is not surprising that it had much in common with it. Both books incorporated allegories, both included dream visions, both illustrated spiritual pilgrimages, and both incorporated sections in verse. Both books' writers became highly popular authors. Bunyan's book became a bestseller for centuries. It was, for a long time in the UK and in America, the book most people would have in addition to their Bibles. Lewis would also write bestsellers, but this particular book, The Regress, was not one of them. It sold enough that there were 3 editions during his lifetime, but it was not the juggernaut that his Narnia Chronicles and Mere Christianity were to become. Although it is no longer the second best-selling book after the Bible, even for Christians, Pilgrim's Progress continues to perform strongly. One edition of it, for example, frequently ranks number 1 in Christian fantasy on Amazon.com. And that is just one of the multiple editions and versions of it for sale on the site. And although not as many believers use the book's terms as part of their spiritual language, it continues to shape many people's spiritual geography, or at least the famous idea of the Christian life as a pilgrimage. Pilgrim's Regress, on the other hand, is not as well known or frequently read. This is not, of course, because Lewis was not capable of writing a bestseller. Many of his other books are extremely popular. One thinks of Mere Christianity, the above-mentioned Chronicles of Narnia, which all sell millions of copies annually. And it's not because his work is not able to be powerfully impacting spirituality and vocabulary of Christians. His many arguments in Mere Christianity have brought many to the Christian faith, and his Narnian Chronicles have, quote, baptized the imagination, unquote, as he referred to George MacDonald's impact on him. They've done that for many children and teens, strengthening their capacity for faith and wonder. Both works were highly geographical in nature and thus lent themselves well to cartography. Both thus incorporated maps. The renowned cartographer Thomas Conder produced a beautiful long vertical map of Pilgrim's Progress around 1778, and numerous editions throughout the centuries incorporated their own versions of maps. Place played an important role for Lewis as well. The map that illustrated Pilgrim's Regress was divided into 4 quadrants. Above the line that cut across the middle of the page, the northern region represented the ultra-rational and rigid, and the southern stood for the excessively emotional and slack. Unlike the topography of Narnia, which became immensely popular, however, Lewis's locations in Regress never caught on. Meanwhile, many of the locations in Pilgrim's Progress became famous metaphors. The Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair, Castle of Despair or Doubting Castle, etc., serving as shorthand for key Christian challenges. We will consider the question of why, given the popularity of both writers and the fact that both Pilgrim's Progress and Pilgrim's Regress are framed as dream visions and present religious pilgrimages with numerous characters and place names that literally name the concepts they embody, Bunyan's books strongly shaped the common Christian imagination in Britain and America, but Lewis's did not. It is instead a later work by Lewis that may bear closer resemblance to Pilgrim's Progress in purpose, impact, and popularity than his Pilgrim's Regress, and we will get to that later. Pilgrim's Progress as an allegory was not Bunyan's only one. He would later write Holy War in 1682 and The Life and Death of Mr. Badman, 1680. We will first examine the background to Bunyan's adoption of allegory as a form. In the introductory poem, Bunyan had spoken about his choice of the format. He explained that he had started to write a book in another format, but somehow fell into the allegorical mode. In writing about the challenges that Christians faced in his day, he started enumerating items and quickly generated several lists of 20 items each. And he pointed to the prophets, apostles, and Christ himself as those who used metaphors to teach truths. The scriptures, he said, are full of dark figures and allegories that bring light into the dark. From where did Bunyan get this idea of allegorizing? Now, we do not know the full list of books that Bunyan read. He hadn't received formal education beyond childhood, but from his autobiography, we learn that he had access to 2 books brought into his marriage: The Practice of Piety by Lewis Bailey, and The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven, 1601, by Arthur Dent. And in Grace Abounding, Bunyan indicated that he had read Martin Luther, his commentary on Galatians, stating that it was, apart from the Bible, before all the books that I have ever seen, most fit for a wounded conscience. And later, he had a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs. But besides the Bible, these may be the only 4 books we are sure that Bunyan encountered. Some of the seeds of allegory for progress may have been planted by Plain Man's Pathway, for the entire book, which is several hundred pages long, is a dialogue, and the table of contents gives the impression of a systematic theology, exploring particularly the areas of anthropology, hamartiology, and soteriology. But the title page and preface to the reader announce the intention to set forth dialogue-wise for the better understanding of the simple. It's a long conversation. With approximately 90,000 words, it would have lasted about 10 hours. It takes place between 4 characters. Mr. Theologos, the Puritan divine, out on his customary walk through pleasant meadows, listening to sweet birdsong, is joined by Philagathus, the honest man. Then two friends who are on their way to purchase a cow join with them. Asuntes, the plain man, who is a very ignorant man in God's matters, and Antholin, the atheist and caviller against all goodness. Philogathus asks many questions of Mr. Theologus, and the result is a long dialogical teaching session on the essentials of the gospel. It is a lively discussion, complete with earthy comments by Antholin, and it ends with a conversion. Asuntus, in bidding farewell to his companions, says that he hopes that this day will be the first day of my repentance and true conversion unto God. He has set off at last, after long hours of conversation, on the pathway to heaven. Arthur Dent, the author of Pathway, was a Puritan pastor in South Shoebury in Essex. Born in Melton Mowbray, he studied at Christ's College, Cambridge, his time there overlapping with the renowned Puritan theologian William Perkins. Like Bunyan, Dent engaged in nonconformity to the state church. But unlike Bunyan, he did not end up in jail for it. In his case, it was involvement in the 1560s vestments controversy and in relation to his participation in the 1584 petition to the Lords of the Queen's Council, or the Privy Council, requesting protection because we refuse to subscribe that there is nothing contained in the Book of Common Prayer contrary to the Word of God. As with Pilgrim's Progress, Plain Man's Pathway would become a bestseller that would continue in print in many editions far after its author's death. The particular edition I've drawn from is the 50th edition, and it was published in the 19th century. There were 25 editions by 1640. Dent had inherited the idea for vigorous dialogue from George Gifford, his fellow student at Christ College, Cambridge, who had written A Brief Discourse of Certain Points of the Religion which is among the common sort of Christians which may be termed the country divinity, 1581, which was published while Dent was a pastor 4 miles away from Gifford. Although Plain Man's Pathway is likely source for Bunyan's format, it is unlikely to be the only one. Pilgrim's Progress expands far beyond its 4 characters, incorporates action, explores place far more, and incorporates a dream framework. All of these characteristics are present in another work with which Bunyan may have been familiar, Piers Plowman. It is possible that Bunyan would have known of Piers Plowman, a 14th century epic poem by William Langland. It was an allegory set in the Malvern Hills during a time of plague. Composed in alliterative verse, but not rhymed, it presented a series of dream visions. Will, the dreamer, set off in his dreams to find Piers the Plowman, a simple man who could teach him how to live a virtuous life, a Christian life, during a time of great sin. As a Puritan, Bunyan may have read Piers Plowman in an edition published by Protestants. Robert Crowley, the Protestant clergyman and printer, for example, had published a version of it in 1550. Since it was a satire that critiqued corruption in the medieval church, Protestant reformers had found it a helpful ally in their cause. The main character, Will, in searching for Piers in order to learn from him how to live a virtuous Christian life, encountered many different figures, including ones that were personifications of virtues and vices. Positive characters included Lady Mead, representing merit or reward, conscience, reason, Holy Church, charity, faith, hope, and patience. Negative ones represented the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, greed, sloth, gluttony, lust, and wrath. And then there were the 3 ways of do well, do better, and do best. Building on these inspirations, Bunyan went much further than either, developing a long, elaborate allegory that captured the imagination. His main character, aptly named Christian, stood in for all believers, an everyman for all those headed towards heaven. And that became the goal of Christian, who set out, after conversion, towards the celestial city. Along the long pilgrimage, he encountered numerous challenges: awkward or antagonistic characters, and dangerous locations. And God, although absent in terms of a portrayal by any particular character in the story, was providentially present by implication of the constant, propitious arrivals of helpful characters and resources. 250 years later, C.S. Lewis wrote an allegory directly related to Pilgrim's Progress. It was the first book that Lewis published after becoming a Christian, and it presented his conversion narrative. It is interesting that the first form that Lewis adopted to communicate his conversion was not memoir, but allegory, and that he modeled his telling on a particular book. Why did he do so? In order to answer that, we need to get a sense of Lewis's history with Pilgrim's Progress. How did Lewis even know about it? Well, Lewis was a lover of books. As a teenager, he had read extensively in pre-20th century literature. As a medievalist, he specialized in English works, and Pilgrim's Progress was a pre-20th century English work. The first mention we have of his reading Pilgrim's Progress is in a letter in November of 1916 when he's 17 years old, but it appears to refer to a rereading rather than a first reading. He wrote to his father, referring to Pilgrim's Progress as our own friend, perhaps implying that they had read it together before. He thought the allegory was obvious and even childish, but in comparing the work as a whole to Macaulay and Ruskin, he judged it as diamonds compared to tinsel. It appears that he had a rather high opinion of the work, and he was very happy to have found it. In late 1916, he wrote to his close friend Arthur Greeves about ordering a Temple Classics edition of Pilgrim's Progress and reading the book again and being awfully bucked. It thus sounds like he may have read the book twice in 1 year in 2 different editions. Writing from Oxford to Arthur in 1917, he mentioned that he didn't have, quote, much of an ear for prose style, unquote, beyond Thomas Mallory, John Ruskin, the King James Version of the Bible, and Bunyan. In 1918, after sending his father his set of poems, Spirits in Bondage, he brought Pilgrim's Progress into a discussion of what to use as a subtitle for his book of poetry. Should he use the term cycle, series, or sequence? Or should he follow the practice modeled by Pilgrim's Progress of a book's subtitle indicating its purpose? Pilgrim's Progress being an account of his journey from this world to the next. But it appears that in the end he settled on a cycle of lyrics. In the summer of 1920, he joined others in publishing a volume of metrical poetry that included a polemical preface against the vorticist trend of poetry, which lacked meter or rhyme. They planned to entitle it The Way's the Way, after a passage in Pilgrim's Progress. Quote, some have wished the next way to their father's house were here, that they might be troubled no more with either hills or mountains to go over, but the way is the way, and there's an end. In a diary entry for June 18, 1923, Lewis expressed annoyance at an exam question that linked Bunyan with Thomas Shadwell, thus rendering his knowledge of Bunyan inadequate to complete the essay. And on April 8, 1924, when Lewis was carrying clay for his cats, a bucket of salt water for someone with an injured foot, and a heavy load of coal, he mentioned that someone told him that he reminded her of, quote, Christian with his burden in Bunyan, unquote. In 1929, as he found himself increasingly drawn to the Christian faith, Lewis read both Bunyan's Grace Abounding and his Mr. Badman, rating the former incomparably the better, unquote. He quoted several sentences from it that he found, quote, reached right down, unquote. And then he pondered the mystery of Bunyan's having heard for hours a voice repeatedly saying, sell him, driving him to despair. Lewis wondered if it was a similar impulse to that which one has to throw a newly purchased book into the fire simply because it is exactly what one doesn't want to do. He found that he couldn't dismiss the emotionally, quote, darker side of religion, unquote, that he saw in writers like Bunyan. In January 1930, he expressed to Arthur his horror at the idea referred to by Bunyan and also mentioned by Christ that the saints will help judge the damned. He questioned Arthur's cherry-picking of characteristics of Christ in the Gospels, but he excused Bunyan's vindictiveness in light of his imprisonment. In August 18, 1930, Lewis made an allusion to Bunyan's Valley of Humiliation, again in a letter to Arthur, and again in September 1931 to Bunyan's, quote, neighbor so-and-so, unquote. The next month, Lewis wrote to Arthur Greeves that he'd had the fateful conversation with J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, suggesting to him that Christ's story was a, quote, true myth, unquote, similar to other myths, but with a key difference that it had actually happened, and Lewis had reached the point of being almost sure that it was true. Not long after, he had the momentous sidecar ride to Whipsnade Zoo, in which somehow he came to a place of belief in Christ, and his whole life changed. The first factor that may have led to the difference in the popularity of the works was the context in which the texts were composed. Pilgrim's Progress was born in an English jail. It thus joined what would become a long line of well-known works that have emerged in prison. Boethius' On the Consolation of Philosophy, circa 523. Sir Thomas Malory, La Morte d'Arthur, circa 1470. Miguel de Cervantes, Don Quixote, circa 1605. Thomas More's Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, 1534, which was penned in the Tower of London. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from Birmingham Jail, 1963, and Nelson Mandela's Prison Letters. Bunyan was in jail in Bedford for preaching. He was a gifted and popular preacher, but when Charles II was restored to the throne, it became illegal to preach outside of the Church of England. As a nonconformist Puritan, Bunyan chose not to belong to the Church of England, so he couldn't be licensed to preach. And Bunyan, although sentenced to 3 months for preaching without a license, ended up staying in prison for over 12 years because he refused to promise to stop preaching if released. He would later end up in prison a second time for a shorter stint. During his first prison stay, Bunyan began to write Pilgrim's Progress. It wasn't his only prison piece. He had written The Heavenly Footman, which wasn't published until after his death, and a spiritual autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Thus, he was writing Pilgrim's Progress after having already processed his conversion journey through another book, one that was written in the first person as a memoir. And the fact that Pilgrim's Progress was born in prison may also have implied that there was a longer, deeper gestation period for the book than Lewis would have had for Regress. Indeed, rather than belonging to the category of prison literature, Pilgrim's Regress lands in a category we might label fast literature. Charles Dickens, for example, concerned about the poor, had planned to write a pamphlet, but then realized a story would probably be more effective. He happened as well to be financially strapped at the time and needed income to support his family. So he wrote A Christmas Carol in 6 weeks in order to get it published in time for Christmas. C.S. Lewis took an even shorter time span in which to write The Pilgrim's Regress, 2 weeks. It was not long after he became a believer, and it was while he was staying for a fortnight with his friend Arthur Greaves in Belfast. How did their falling into the categories of prison and fast literature impact differences between Progress and Regress? The locations differed, of course, with prison's austerity contrasted with a cozy Irish home. There were presumably fewer distractions for Bunyan than for Lewis. And it was not just a difference in location. There was the duration element as well. Bunyan was more likely able to concentrate and ponder for longer, being stuck in the same place the whole time, with far less to do than Lewis. Lewis was juggling responsibilities as a caretaker at home for Mrs. Minto and Maureen, while teaching and tutoring at Magdalen College. Did the relative solitude of Arthur's home inspire him to write? Did he perhaps feel pressure to complete the work before returning home and ramping up for the new school year? And did the speed with which he thus wrote impact Pilgrim's Regress? A second area of contrast may be in the amount of formal education that each had. We do not know exactly when Bunyan left school to help his father as a tinker, but it may have been as early as age 9. Lewis, on the other hand, went all the way through to a doctorate at Oxford University. This contrast may have impacted their respective allegories. Bunyan's book had succeeded in being easily understood. The characters were clearly named for what they represented. The character who exhibited faith was named Faith. Evangelist represented evangelism. Friend embodied friendship. The same was true for locations. The location that stood for depression was termed the Slough of Despond. Vanity Fair captured the temptation of sinful worldly pleasures. And perhaps most important, the concepts represented were ones with which ordinary lay folk could identify. Lewis's book, on the other hand, was not easily understood. In fact, it was so misunderstood that he ended up writing a preface to the 3rd edition to attempt to explain it. The project was highly personal for Lewis, for the allegory was about his own conversion, but he had intended it to be an everyman journey as well. What he hadn't realized was that his experience was unusual. Most people, for example, were not wrestling with the most recent philosophical trends. And Regress wasn't as emotionally accessible as Progress. The characters representing various contemporary philosophies tended to be intellectually interesting, but not relatable to ordinary everyday life or spiritual realities in the way that Pilgrim's Progress's characters were. Bunyan had consciously sought to unite the intellect and emotions of the reader. In his versed preface, he explicitly invited the reader to, quote, "Come hither and lay my book, thy head and heart together," unquote. Regress, whether intentionally or not, appealed more to the mind than to the heart, and this seems to have made it less emotionally engaging. So many of the characters and much of the dialogue were philosophical rather than personal. And thus, it also seems that Progress may have fitted better with the Romantics than Regress would have, ironically. The Romantics preferred symbolism to allegory, which we'll look at in a moment. However, it was, again, ironically, the Romantics who had helped bring back the popularity of Pilgrim's Progress after it had faded a bit due to the 18th century's emphasis on rationalism. The Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge assessed Pilgrim's Progress as follows. This wonderful work is one of the few books which may be read over repeatedly at different times, and each time with a new and different pleasure. I read it once as a theologian, and let me assure you that there is great theological acumen in the work, once with devotional feelings, and once as a poet. I could not have believed beforehand that Calvinism could be painted in such exquisitely delightful colors, unquote. Part of what the Romantics appreciated about Pilgrim's Progress was its lack of refinement. Bunyan's work was colorful rather than polished, and his fewer years of formal education worked to his benefit, his work thus being seen as that of a natural genius. A third contrast in their life situations at the time of writing their allegories is that Bunyan had been a Christian for many years, whereas Lewis had only recently converted. Bunyan and Lewis had in common a long period of questioning the Christian faith. They had both been raised in Christian families and church communities, and both had rejected the faith for many years. Their allegories, however, were written at different stages of their Christian journey. Pilgrim's Regress was published when Lewis was 35 years old, Pilgrim's Progress when Bunyan was 50. For Lewis, conversion was only a year or so ago. For Bunyan, at least 20 years had passed. Thus, Lewis was writing exclusively about conversion, but Bunyan was presenting the sanctification process as well. And Bunyan was significantly more spiritually mature and experienced. This may have contributed significantly to their relative impact. In exploring the Christian life rather than simply Christian conversion, Pilgrim's Progress aided Christians in their ongoing walks in the faith, which is why it made it such valuable, repeated reading. For many, it became a frequently consulted companion along their spiritual journeys. Lewis's relationship with allegory differed from Bunyan's and was rather complex. In The Allegory of Love, 1936, he argued that matters of, quote, love, religion, and spiritual adventure, unquote, were ideal for allegory, for they are abstract realities that only allegory could capture. In his preface to the third edition of Pilgrim's Regress, he stated that, rather than disguising things, allegory could reveal things, making the interior life more tangible by giving it an imaginative, concrete form. Elsewhere, he seemed to prefer the, quote, mythical or symbolical, unquote, writing to Professor Elizabeth Butler in 1940, that as stories move from the mythical or symbolical toward the allegorical, the reader's pleasure is reduced. He appears to advocate the movement away from the conceptual towards the imaginative, of writers paying attention to the sense of significance of the whole rather than the one-to-one correspondence of the separate properties, unquote. Now, although Lewis had an appreciation for a well-done allegory, he seems to have moved away from it towards symbolism or myth as time went on. And by the time he wrote the Narnia Chronicles, Lewis corrected those who referred to the Chronicles, especially his The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as an allegory for the Gospel. Lewis explained in a letter of 1958 to Martha B. Hook that the book was a supposition, not an allegory. He did not want readers to find one-to-one correspondence between the various elements of the story and the biblical narrative. Rather, it was a wondering about how Jesus would have behaved had he landed in a world similar to Narnia. He even went so far as to directly contrast his treatment of Aslan with the approach in Pilgrim's Progress taken towards the giant Despair, who represented despair. He says straight out that his Narnia supposition is not an allegory. Lewis preferred myth, defined rather broadly and to include the myth-like quality as well. He preferred it to allegory. Quote, "When allegory is at its best, it approaches myth," he said. Myth engages the imagination more than the intellect. An allegory should work as a story in and of itself, or else what was the point of creating a story rather than just speaking literally about the matter in question? But myth or fairy story, which Lewis on occasion mentioned in the same breath, goes further, moving away from the one-to-one correspondence which speaks to the mind, to allowing the reader to enter vicariously into an experience of reality itself. Myth is polysemic, drawing in readers from all ages with various meanings drawn by different readers. It should be awe-inspiring and numinous. I would suggest that shifts in 2 of the 4 contrasting areas contributed to another Pilgrim's Progress-esque book by Lewis being more popular than Pilgrim's Regress. Like Pilgrim's Progress, it was a book that traced a pilgrimage, became a perennial bestseller, and has had a profound impact on many people's spiritual lives and the way that they speak about the Christian life. And that book is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The Voyage addressed the relative lack of tension that Pilgrim's Regress had in comparison to Pilgrim's Progress. In paying so much attention to capturing the intellectual content of each character's represented philosophy or concepts in Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis seems to have invested less effort into the story itself, particularly on building tension. There does not appear to be a strong sense of purpose for his main character. In Pilgrim's Progress, it was clear what was at stake for Christian. Would he reach the celestial city, an outcome with eternal consequences? The terror of hell that Lewis considered so important in giving urgency to Pilgrim's Progress was missing from Pilgrim's Regress. What was at stake for John? He wanted to get to the island, but what did he lose if he didn't get there? As a result, readers perhaps did not connect emotionally as much with Pilgrim's Regress as with Pilgrim's Progress. And this is perhaps part of the reason why Progress shaped the vocabulary of Christians, while Regress didn't. All of this changed with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There was a great deal at stake for the various characters. Eustace, having turned into a dragon and being unable to shed his skin, risked remaining trapped and alone forever. Lucy, discovering a book of spells, faced the temptation of giving in to vanity and reciting an incantation, which would have led to devastating wars. And Reepicheep, the noble talking mouse, gave up everything to reach the utter east. What caused this change in intensity and engagement? Well, first, there are the shifts that happened in the area of life circumstances. By the time he wrote The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, published in 1952, Lewis was about 50 years old, similar age to Bunyan's, and he had been a Christian for at least 20 years, similar length of time as Bunyan had since his own conversion. So Lewis's circumstances had come closer to those of Bunyan at the time that he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. The second key to all this change, it would appear, was that Lewis moved away from allegory to fairy story. In an article in the New York Times in November 18th of 1956, titled "Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said," Lewis explained that he could have approached the Narnia Chronicles by creating a list of core Christian beliefs and then turning them into allegories. But he didn't. Instead, he started with images that he let play in his imagination until they turned into stories. And the fairy story, a highly mythic form, fit best. The Narnia Chronicles thus leaned heavily away from allegory towards the mythical. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader maintained the spiritual pilgrimage told as a fictional narrative, but in shifting from the form of an allegory to that of a fairy story, it left the crack-the-code correspondence, or at least the obvious names of characters and places. In following the move away from allegory to symbolism that the Romantic views of the time promoted, Lewis incorporated extensive symbolism and vivified the story elements. As Lewis allowed the story to take over and the one-to-one correspondences to fade away, the spiritual experiences inculcated vicariously in the reader became transformative. This was still spiritual pilgrimage, but the destination now had a powerful pull. Shifting away from allegory to symbolism allowed for God himself to be represented in the story. In Pilgrim's Progress, no character directly stood for God. God provided through other characters and resources rather than through his own presence. But in the Voyage, as with the other chronicles, God showed up in the form of Aslan, the regal lion. Had Bunyan's rawness given him more freedom from strict allegory than Lewis's scholarly training had? And so, was it only when Lewis allowed himself to move away from the allegory towards symbolism and consequently make it possible for the story to take over, that he was able then to pull the reader into a pilgrimage of their own? The scene in which Eustace, who was transformed into a dragon and was trapped in his dragon skin and needed Aslan to rescue him, is one of the more powerful scenes of repentance and regeneration in literature. It draws on the richer experience of the Christian life gained by Lewis in the decades since Pilgrim's Regress. As Aslan gashes the thick layers of skin and peels them raw off him, restoring him to human flesh, we as readers identify with Eustace, and we experience vicariously what deep sanctification feels like on occasion. God's severe mercy sears our imaginations. And the ending of the Voyage approaches the power of that for Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress had ended with Pilgrim crossing the river to the celestial city and saying, quote, "I see myself now at the end of my journey. My toilsome days are ended. I am going to see that face that was spit upon for me. Now I go where I shall live by sight, and shall be with him in whose company I delight myself. His name has been to me as a civet box, yea, sweeter than all perfumes. His voice to me has been most sweet, and his countenance I have more desired than they that have most desired the light of the sun. His words I did use to gather for my food, and for antidotes against my paintings. He hath held me, and hath kept me from my iniquities. Yes, my steps have been strengthened in his way." Unquote. And he then plunged into the water towards his longed-for destination. The parallel scene in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader finds the children accompanying the talking mouse, Reepicheep. He has been yearning for the east, for Aslan's country, throughout the entire journey. And now they have arrived near where the end of the world, where a brief breeze wafts towards them sweet sound and smell from the immense green forested mountains and tall waterfalls at the ocean's edge. Heartbreaking without being sad, it is heaven's Sehnsucht triggering beauty breaking in. As Lewis moved farther away from the allegorical form of Pilgrim's Progress, while preserving the heart of the pilgrimage, he grew closer to capturing the beauty of the ending of Pilgrim's Progress. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader arrived at the destination that Pilgrim's Regress may have aimed at, but did not quite capture. It did so by abandoning allegory. After all, Pilgrim's Progress wasn't about an allegory. Rather, it was an invitation to traverse the pathway to heaven. And so, brave Reepicheep, after his long pilgrimage voyage, flings his tiny sword into the water lilies and wades with joy towards Aslan's country, extending that same invitation to us.
Gwenfair, thank you for such an excellent lecture for us this evening. I'm now going to hand over to Mark Burkill, one of the other trustees of the St Andin Lecture, who has some questions to start.
Yes, well, just one particular question, really, but thank you, Gwenfair, very much indeed on behalf of the trustees. But time is short, so I shall press on very speedily. One thing that struck me reading Pilgrim's Progress as a at least retired vicar now, is its pastoral wisdom. I guess that again comes from a maturity. C.S. Lewis was never a pastor, but that's just a side ride. Can I just ask you about the word pilgrim, really, or and how, whether that has had bad associations from its medieval background, or just I'm interested that Bunyan used that word.
Indeed, yes. So there were works from the medieval period that used that term that were not popular coming into the Reformation and then into Puritanism. For example, the Pilgrimage of the Life of Man was a work that had been translated from the French by John Lydgate, and it was very popular in its time. And it took the concept of pilgrimage from birth all the way through life to the celestial city. It actually used that same term. But as far as I know, it wasn't reprinted by the Reformers or by the Puritans. And I think it may have been because it was presenting more of a Catholic viewpoint of looking at a Christian's life as having started when one was born and being brought through the entire life up to heaven, going through the sacraments and so on. Whereas you have Bunyan's approach really representing the Protestant / Reformed / Puritan approach, which emphasizes conversion. And so you don't have it starting with his birth and being a pilgrimage through the entire life of man. It's really taking its focus from when he is first confronted with the gospel and so on. So he turned, I think, the meaning of the pilgrimage theologically so that it fit better with the Protestant way of expressing the gospel. So I'm not sure that the term itself became negative. It was more the way that it had been presented in the medieval period. Now, they did bring Piers Plowman into publication, so they weren't rejecting entirely medieval conceptions of pilgrimage.
It's just to finish it off, it's interesting. Dent used the word pathway, being earlier, more associated perhaps with in pre-Reformation things, whereas so you're saying in a sense that Bunyan sort of could redefine or was free to redefine what pilgrim, the associations that the word pilgrim had. Yeah.
Yes, it's an interesting contrast between those two books because they very nicely capture the differences between the way that the medieval person would have conceived of the Christian life as pilgrimage and the way that a Protestant would.
Yeah. Okay.
You may be interested to know that in the Anglican homilies from 1547, which Bunyan may have heard read out in churches, it does say this, that we may perceive that life in this world is compared to a pilgrimage in a foreign country far from God. And we see that death, delivering us from our bodies, sends us straight home to our own country and makes us dwell in the presence of God forever in perpetual rest and quietness. So to die is no loss, but profit and winning for all true Christian people. So that idea of the Christian life as a pilgrimage is there in the Anglican homilies too.
Nice. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Anyone else want to?
Is there anyone else on the Zoom today who has a question that you'd either like to ask or put in the chat? Ros Clark.
I do. Gwenfair, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm not sure I've ever read Pilgrim's Regress, so I will have to rectify that. But the other two I'm very familiar with. And I'm interested as to whether you have any thoughts on why those two books, I mean, and Narnia in general, have been so successful as literature that have captured a wider imagination, not just among Christians. I mean, that's certainly true with Narnia. And I think to some extent, the examples you were giving at the beginning, I think it's true of Pilgrim's Progress as well, that it certainly had longevity that went well beyond what we might think of as evangelical Christians, at least, and maybe beyond Christians as well. And whether there's something, there's so much Christian literature that doesn't really succeed in that way. And yet, and I think of other media as well, films and things where as Christians we're very excited, all this substitute or there's sacrifice or there's something going on in there. But whether there's something about those particular narratives and the way they're told that enables the gospel story that lies behind them or in front of them or in them in some way to permeate wider culture as well.
Thank you. Yes. Now, they are, of course, in very different time periods, Pilgrim's Progress and then the Narnia Chronicles. And so Pilgrim's Progress had the advantage of not having to compete with as many books as C.S. Lewis's works have had to compete with. And C.S. Lewis's works, of course, emerged during a time period when there wasn't quite as much going on as now, although his works continued to be popular. So I think with Pilgrim's Progress, I do think that he manages to capture a story that engages the reader. Yes, the allegory is quite prominent with all the characters being named for what they represent, but there's enough of a story to be able to carry the imagination, to be able to give space to the imagination of the reader. And it is a cohesive story. And there is something about having the Christian life presented as a story that I think is very compelling. I think we take for granted, perhaps as Christians, that life has that story element to it, that it has a telos, an end goal, that there's a cohesion to it, that our identities are not necessarily fixed, but we have identities that carry through. We take that for granted, but that has not always been the case in all parts of the world. I think Augustine was one of the earliest to help frame that for us as Christians in his Confessions. So I think part of the popularity with John Bunyan's work is that he is taking both the conversion part, but also the ongoing sanctification process and making it identifiable for Christians so that they can see themselves in the story and they can find encouragement and look for these kinds of characters, not symbolically, but, in their own lives. They're not going to come across someone named that, but to be able to look for those resources in their own lives. And I think with C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, it's a little bit different. I think there's even more room for the imagination. And of course, he's taking us into fantasy realms and into worlds that you really want to be a part of, as children especially. He's also aiming them at children. And so children having even more of a capacity, I think, for imagination than we as adults do sometimes. And so children's imaginations are being captured. They're being taken into a world that they want to be a part of. And they are getting to encounter Christ in symbolical, sort of metaphorical way that is so engaging, and in a way that they may be able to relate to in some ways more easily, perhaps, than elsewhere. And that can bring them back then into this world. And that is expressly stated by Lewis at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in that Aslan addresses the children and tells them that he's brought them into this world, into the sort of Narnia world for a while, to meet him there, so that when they go back into their world, they'll be able to find him there more deeply, as it were. And I think the Narnia Chronicles have done that for so many of us over the years, and I think that's part of their enduring popularity.
Yeah, I think we probably do need to
probably need to wrap up in a moment. Have we got time for one more question, Gwenfair?
Okay. Yeah.
If someone has one.
Yeah, I have one.
Oh, okay.
Lee, I know. Yes.
You show that Bunyan's years-long spiritual maturity allowed him to write not just about conversion, but about sanctification as well. Whereas Lewis, in the Pilgrim's Regress, was only really a year into his own faith. So how far do you think depth of living Christian experience is essential for writing spiritually effective narratives? But also, shouldn't we be reading books by much older Christians rather than these young guys in their 30s and 40s, if that's, the case.
Right. Great question. Yes, I know of authors, Christian theologians, and I don't want to say the names in case I get it wrong, but who have very deliberately waited until they were 50 before starting to write books for Christian audiences and so on. So there is something to be said for that, but I think there is a place for works in progress, as it were, as well. And so I wouldn't want to make it a norm that you have to wait until you're older before writing. But I think we do see some evidence that perhaps, especially ones that apply to the Christian life, it does pay to wait until one has experienced more of walking with God, of experiencing life with Him, and of having some challenges while walking with Him. Now, C.S. Lewis had experienced many challenges before he became a believer. He had lost his mother when he was a young child. He was in World War I on the front lines. He had been injured in the battle, and he knew what suffering was, but he had gone through all of that without being in an active relationship of faith with God. And so he was not in a place to be able to talk yet about what it means to walk with God, whereas Bunyan had decades of experience by the time he was writing Pilgrim's Progress, and I think you can see it in the difference in their works. I do think that Lewis was also being fresh into walking as a believer. I ran across something in here in the fellowship by the Zaleskis, where they are pointing out and they are drawing on what Lewis says himself in the third edition, in his preface to the third edition of Pilgrim's Regress, which was that he was a bit angry while he was writing it, and you can sense it in the writing. He's angry at the things that kept him away from God, I think, and so it's not as pleasant to read the book because it's about anger a little bit. Whereas when he becomes more mature, he's able to engage more thoughtfully and graciously, perhaps, with the struggles that people go through on the way to coming to know God. And so that graciousness shows up in spades, I think, in the Narnia Chronicles.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and thank you so much for answering some of our questions. Those who are on the call may like to look at some of the previous St. Antholin lectures. There's one on John Bunyan by Jim Packer from 1999, which I've got as a little booklet, but can also be found in the compilation from those years too. But I guess many of us will now be going back and rereading the Pilgrim's Regress and Voyage of the Dawn Treader with new eyes, and perhaps even reading Pilgrim's Progress again. If you haven't read it already, why not? Let's get to it. So thank you very much, Gwenfair, for this evening's St. Antholin lecture. The lecture itself, in a fuller version with all the footnotes and everything, is being published by the Latimer Trust. If you look out on their website, it will be available there shortly, in the next few days. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to Gwenfair for a wonderfully stimulating lecture this evening.